Have you ever felt that your best friend isn't being entirely honest with you? Because that's exactly how Mr Utterson feels. His dear friend Dr Jekyll seems to be tangled up in a sinister plot involving that monstrous man, Mr Edward Hyde. But Dr Jekyll won't open up about his situation or allow Mr Utterson to help him. What would you do if you were in Mr Utterson's shoes? A year has passed. Recently, London has been shaken by news of a crime so terrible, so violent, that it's hard to believe. And guess who's involved? You got it, that devil, Mr Hyde. A maidservant saw the whole thing from her upstairs bedroom window. This is what she reported. It was 11 o'clock at night, and she was getting ready for bed. Sitting at her window, she casually admired the beautiful view of London on that clear autumn night. The Thames River sparkled under the full moon. Then she noticed a distinguished elderly gentleman walking down the lane. Coming towards him was a much smaller man. As the two men approached one another, they seemed to start a conversation. The older gentleman was perfectly civil and polite, but the smaller man was rude. That's when the maid recognised him. She knew his name was Mr Hyde because he'd visited her employer once before. She also distinctly remembered immediately disliking him. On this night, Mr Hyde carried a heavy walking cane. He listened to the older gentleman with thinly veiled annoyance, but then suddenly he broke out into a rage. The older gentleman drew back, offended by Mr Hyde's behaviour. Without any warning, Mr Hyde began to club the defenceless gentleman to death. The maid heard the sickening sound of his bones breaking as Mr Hyde pummelled him on the ground. The maid was so shocked by what she saw that she fainted. When she regained consciousness at around 2 a.m, she immediately got up and called the police. By this time, Mr Hyde had fled the scene. All that was left was the mangled corpse of the poor old gentleman. And lying beside him was half of Mr Hyde's walking cane. He'd hit the old man so hard that he'd snapped it clean in half. The police could only find a purse and gold watch on the victim, and a letter for Mr Utterson. What are the chances? In the morning, the dead man's letter is delivered to Mr Utterson, along with the news of the murder. He quickly gets dressed, hurries through his breakfast, and drives to the police station to see the body. When he arrives, Utterson confirms that the victim was a well-known politician named Sir Danvers Carew. The attending officer is astonished and says it will cause a sensation in the news. He then tells Mr Utterson what the maid had reported, including the name of Mr Hyde. Mr Utterson is filled with dread. When he sees Mr Hyde's smashed cane, he can deny it no longer. In fact, he'd given it to Dr Jekyll as a gift many years ago. Mr Utterson then leads the officers to Mr Hyde's house in Soho to continue the investigation. Mr Hyde had mentioned this address to Utterson on the night they first met. It's in a seedy area of London, and a thick brown fog slows their progress through the dingy streets. When they arrive at Mr Hyde's lodgings, a mean-looking housekeeper answers the door. She confirms that Mr Hyde lives there, but is unsure about his whereabouts. He'd been there briefly during the night, but then he'd gone again. And there's no telling when he'll be back because his habits are so irregular. The gentlemen enter to inspect the house. Other than the old woman, no one else seems to live here. Mr Hyde uses only a couple of rooms. Though these rooms are elegant and richly furnished, it looks like many of the items here are gifts from Dr Jekyll himself. But today the rooms are also an enormous mess. There are clothes everywhere, evidence of a checkbook being burned in the fire, and there, the other half of the murder weapon is lying behind the door. The officer is delighted. Case open and shut. But tracking down the man himself proves very difficult. He doesn't seem to have any surviving family. There are no photos that have ever been taken of him, and the housekeeping staff only see him now and then. But everyone who's ever met Mr Hyde all agree on one thing. He has a haunting sense of being wrong. It's time to confront Dr Jekyll again about the truth of Mr Hyde, and it's Mr Utterson's grim job to do it. It's late afternoon by the time Mr Utterson arrives at Dr Jekyll's doorstep. Mr Poole, the butler, quickly ushers him in, leading him through Dr Jekyll's laboratory and into his office. There Dr Jekyll sits, a changed man. He is looking deathly ill, pale, with cold hands, and his voice doesn't sound the same. Mr Utterson asks him if he's heard about the murder. Of course Dr Jekyll has heard about it. The newsboys have been yelling it up and down the neighbourhood. When Utterson starts asking questions about Mr Hyde, Dr Jekyll loses his composure. With a distressed cry, he swears that he will never see Mr Hyde again. But Mr Utterson is not convinced, and Dr Jekyll doesn't seem like himself. He is feverish and appears desperate. He insists that Mr Hyde will never come back, and even hands Utterson a letter that's supposedly from Hyde himself. It says that Mr Hyde has found a surefire way to escape without harm. Dr Jekyll also reveals that, quite conveniently, he accidentally burned the envelope, erasing any hope at seeing where Hyde might have gone. Mr Utterson has one final critical question for his friend. Did Mr Hyde force him to write that awful will, leaving everything to Mr Hyde if Dr Jekyll dies or disappears? Dr Jekyll can only nod in confirmation. This convinces Utterson once and for all that Mr Hyde planned to murder Dr Jekyll. Mr Utterson takes the letter for safekeeping and tells Dr Jekyll he's had a lucky escape. Who knows? Perhaps instead of Sir Danvers Carew, Mr Hyde would have killed Dr Jekyll instead. Dr Jekyll says he's learned a valuable lesson through this whole ordeal, but he doesn't say exactly what the lesson is. On his way out, Mr Utterson asks Mr Poole if he saw anyone drop off a letter. Poole says only the regular mail has been received, nothing delivered by hand. How could the letter just have materialised? Or worse, maybe Mr Hyde came by undetected and is still a very real danger to Dr Jekyll. Mr Utterson returns home with a fresh spike of anxiety. That evening, Mr Utterson sits by his fireside with Mr Guest, his clerk. Mr Guest is particularly gifted on the topic of handwriting, so Mr Utterson shows him Mr Hyde's letter. After looking at it very carefully, Mr Guest requests to see a sample of Dr Jekyll's handwriting. To Mr Utterson's horror, Mr Guest shows him that the handwriting matches. Why would Dr Henry Jekyll forge for a murderer? Utterson's blood runs cold at the thought. Time passes, and Mr Hyde is nowhere to be found, not even after thousands of pounds are offered as reward for information. Secretly, though, Mr Utterson thinks Sir Carew's death did some good in ensuring Mr Hyde could never return. Because sure enough, with Mr Hyde's disappearance, Dr Jekyll is a new man. He comes out of seclusion, patches up old friendships, and even gets involved in charities and religious activities. His face seems more open, brighter. For more than 2 months, the doctor finds peace and does good in the community. But one day in mid-January, Dr Jekyll's doors are suddenly shut to all visitors once again. Mr Poole admits no one. After seeing him daily for almost 2 months, Mr Utterson starts to feel uneasy. He decides to visit Dr Lanyon. Utterson is shocked to find that Dr Lanyon is also completely different. Where once he was jolly and open-hearted, he is now a ghost. He's visibly balder, thinner and frailer. Mr Utterson can't believe how quickly the change has taken place. Dr Lanyon says he's had a terrible shock and can't even talk about it. He's so weakened by it that he's sure he only has a few weeks left to live. So from now until his death, Dr Lanyon doesn't want to hear the name of Dr Henry Jekyll. Mr Utterson is deeply disturbed by this new change over his 2 good friends. Once home, he writes a letter to Dr Jekyll, trying to get some answers. He needs to know why he's shut himself away again, and what on earth has happened between himself and Dr Lanyon. Dr Jekyll replies, confirming that his friendship with Dr Lanyon has ended. He also mentions that his seclusion is a form of punishment, one that he will never escape from. Mr Utterson is stunned. What the devil is going on? Sadly, Dr Lanyon dies within a fortnight. After the funeral, a grieving Mr Utterson sits down with a sealed letter from the late Dr Lanyon. He decides to read it and opens the seal, only to find a second envelope within. It warns Mr Utterson not to read it unless Dr Henry Jekyll has died or disappeared. There, the word disappeared again. Isn't Mr Hyde and his evil influence gone? Why would Dr Jekyll disappear? Mr Utterson decides to keep trying to see Dr Jekyll. Someone has to get to the bottom of these sinister mysteries. But Mr Poole always turns Utterson away, saying that Dr Jekyll has shut himself in his laboratory and refuses to come out. Will we ever get answers about Dr Jekyll's seclusion? Or Mr Hyde's unexplained disappearance? Or perhaps he hasn't gone far after all? We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.